It is one of the most mysterious places on earth. An entire sovereign nation surrounded by a single city. The Vatican. For centuries, it has influenced world events, perhaps more than any other country on earth. How could the world's smallest country wield such power? Secrets. The secrets it holds behind these very walls.
It's a secret place for many reasons, and one is that it gets up to things it doesn't want people to know about.
This is the setting for Dan Brown's best-selling book, Angels and Demons. But are dark forces trying to destroy the church, as Dan Brown suggests?
I think secret societies evolved at that time and came about through a reaction to the ominous presence of the Catholic Church.
Could an ancient cult rise again to infiltrate Vatican security and assassinate a pope?
Popes have undoubtedly been murdered.
Could this same secret society be planning to take over world governments?
The agenda of all secret societies is to rule the masses so that the masses become slaves, fodder, malleable, useful, eliminatable laboratory animals.
And does this, the dollar bill, hold the secret to a new world order?
We have New World Order right here on our dollar bills, and yet most people are unaware of this.
One person is on a mission to uncover the answers to these very questions and more that are raised in Dan Brown's frightening book. Simon Cox, along with other noted experts, are about to tell us what's fact, what's fiction, and what has yet to be revealed. Rome, once the ruler of the Western world. Today, this nation-city is both the cultural nerve center of Italy and the setting of Dan Brown's best-selling novel, Angels and Demons.
Rome is an amazing place, a city that is like none other than I've ever seen. It's a kind of revelation in the sense that at every turn there's something new. It's like a palimpsest, which is a manuscript in which something's been written, but it's been written over a pre-existing text that's been erased, which itself was written over a previous text that's been erased, so that it's layer upon layer, and it's that layering that is the city of Rome, endless and deep. When you turn a corner, there's a modern building sitting on a Roman building, sitting on something earlier still, and at every corner, at every turn is a new discovery.
But it's not only ancient buildings which lay hidden beneath Rome's streets. In the city where Caesar was murdered, where Constantine helped engineer the emerging religion of Christianity, a new and sinister society reportedly existed. The Illuminati, the Illuminated. Dan Brown's Angels and Demons raises vital questions. Do they still exist? And if they do, who are they?
The central theme within Angels and Demons is this idea of a secret society called the Illuminati. Did they really exist? If so, what period of history? Are they still around? These are questions that are really thrown at us from the book, and Dan Brown tries to answer them by saying, yes, they're a real secret society, they still exist today, they still exert influence and pressure, just as they did through history.
Historian Simon Cox has made a career of studying the past. Now he's making a career investigating the theories behind Dan Brown's mysteries. In his newest book, Illuminating Angels and Demons, Cox finds himself on the trail of the Illuminati, much like Dan Brown's hero, and for good reason.
It's a book that deals with secret societies, with Christianity and its interaction through the ages with us as people, as man, and the idea that there may actually be some other hidden thread of knowledge, of illumination that runs through that.
In the novel, a secret society known as the Illuminati sets out to destroy the Vatican and alter the course of world events. For writer and conspiracy theorist Jim Marrs, the threat is real.
The final goal of the Illuminati is world domination. They go into great detail as to how they're going to accomplish this. They want to educate the young and convert them to their way of thinking. They want to destroy faith and confidence not only in the political systems but in religion.
Fact is slightly different really to the fiction that Dan Brown has brought forward in Angels and Demons, in so much as the Illuminati, through my research I found, did exist as a real society. In fact, there were several different versions of the Illuminati. You have Illuminati springing up in southern France, in Spain.
A look through history books shows that over the centuries, several groups have taken on this name. In Spain, they were persecuted, burned at the stake by the Catholic Church during the famous Inquisitions. But the mystery doesn't stop there.
They're disparate groups, they're not groups that are linked, and the word Illuminati, or illuminated ones, or ones who see the light, is actually, when you think about it, would be a pretty normal name for various groups who want to be enlightened. And so I think that as a coherent body of people, a coherent secret society that has lasted throughout history, stretching all the way back to Egyptian times and through to the modern era, I think it's a non-starter. I don't think you have evidence for that. However, we certainly have evidence that a group called the Illuminati, who may well have existed through to modern times, certainly started in the 1770s in Bavaria.
The Illuminati was a secret society supposedly formed in the spring of 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, who had been trained by the Jesuits.
Devin Jackson is an investigative journalist for some of the most important publications of today. He believes the name Weishaupt is no accident. Jackson suggests that the name was fictitious, part of a secret code used throughout Europe that was the beginning of a fight by elite members of science against church-sponsored governments. Even more, Jackson believes the Illuminati may have started long before Adam Weishaupt took on the name. The question raised, however, is why would such a battle even exist?
The Illuminati came into existence around the time of Galileo because of having this need to explore further and questioning things. And it was in an age of science was burgeoning and kind of busting out, literally almost, out of the confines of the Catholic Church. And so you had all these people like Galileo, and up into the 18th and 19th century, when exploration and this need for finding out things, how things worked in nature or in the universe, they just really had that need to find that out.
I think in earlier centuries the church probably was anti-science because they feared a conflict between their dogma and scientific knowledge.
Did Dan Brown have it right? Could the Illuminati still exist? Could they be trying to destroy world governments? In his investigation, Simon Cox believes the beginning of that answer lies in the very title of Dan Brown's book. A title that may lead us directly to the Illuminati.
The book Angels and Demons, I think, is titled so because what you have here in Dan Brown's estimation, I think, is the idea of the study of light and dark. And so you have this study in dualism. On the one side, we're not sure who the angels are. We're not sure whether the angels is the church or science, because this is a book about church versus science. On the other side, you have the demons. Are the demons science? Is it the church? We're unsure about this. And I think that that's the reasoning behind the title. I think it's quite a clever title to use.
Angels and Demons is a great title. It does sum up very well the duality of the book and the theme of angels that runs through it in the Bernini statues that form the clues that run throughout the book.
In Angels and Demons, the Illuminati gather in secret meeting places throughout ancient Rome. Each location anchors a surreptitious trail that Dan Brown calls the Path of Illumination. And each location is filled with Bernini's masterpieces, which allegedly hold clues to this subversive path, including his most famous work, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Her hand allegedly points towards this path of illumination. Surprisingly, it forms a nearly perfect cross within the city of Rome.
think the path of illumination that Dan Brown highlights in his book is a real, it's something that has been used throughout history, although maybe not in the context that Brown is actually bringing it forward within Angels and Demons. The idea behind neophytes, behind initiates actually walking a path, metaphorical or real, is something that we do find symbolically throughout history.
This alleged path starts at Rome's most famous landmark, the Vatican, a site visited by up to 30 million tourists a year. The path then crosses Tiber River to the east, anchored at Santa Maria della Vittoria. To the north, the cross begins at Santa Maria del Popolo and ends to the south at Piazza Navona. Why a cross for a group allegedly fighting the church? Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett, co-authors of the Templar Revelation, have researched its mysterious origins.
Every religious, spiritual, esoteric discipline will talk about a metaphorical path of illumination.
Whether this exists in the sense of the Illuminati, a group somewhere, have their own views on this, and you have to be initiated into it and do certain things, perhaps horrible, to receive illumination, is open to question.
The Illuminati's scientific beginnings, their rituals, and quest for power are closely tied to the Vatican's own shrouded history. But hidden deep within the Vatican are secret documents which reportedly could be used to destroy the Church. Has the Illuminati infiltrated the Vatican? Have they found the hidden documents? And what will happen if they, or another secret society, finds them?
The Roman Church obviously is among the richest, most powerful institutions on the earth and has been for many centuries. And that's simply because if you go back to the time of the Middle Ages, the church commanded everything.
For over 1,000 years, the Vatican influenced world events while wielding vast control over both kingdoms and royalty.
They told the kings what to do, they loaned money, they ran every facet of everyone's life. And today, of course, with the democracy, freedom springing up around the world, they have lost some of that power, but they are still a very formidable institution. One example of the power of the Roman Church is that in the 1980s they were allowed to open an embassy in Washington, D.C., which is still there today. So we recognize the Vatican as a separate nation, a separate state, and we have diplomatic relations with it, even though to many people this flies in the face of our contention that we have separation of church and state.
The Vatican's location is a key part of Roman Catholic history, one that goes to the core of its faith.
According to Catholic and Vatican history, the bones of St. Peter are buried underneath the cupola of St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, Rome.
But what if the Vatican is not built over the remains of St. Peter? What if something else is buried underneath its ancient floors?
This, though, is open to debate, and it is a contentious issue. Many people suggesting they're not his bones at all. Many people suggesting that they're actually the bones of an animal.
Since its founding by Constantine the Great, nearly 400 years after the death of Jesus, the Vatican has been dogged by accusations of conspiracies and cover-ups, rumors which have continued for centuries. Some of those secrets could undermine the very foundation of the Church. It is information that the Church does not want to fall into enemy hands, like the Illuminati.
We have the catacombs under the Vatican, which hardly anyone has ever been able to penetrate. All kinds of wild stories circulate about that, up to and including the possibility that they have the mummified body of Jesus, that they have lots of ancient artifacts, lots of historical objects that could point to a more honest and true understanding of human origins.
So there is that reality behind it. There is, it's a secret place. It is secret for many reasons, and one is that it gets up to things it doesn't want people to know about.
The Church believes that St. Peter was given the authority by Christ to set up his church forever because St. Peter was the first person to see the risen Christ. This is a kind of article of faith of the Catholic Church. And all you have to do is read the New Testament to discover that it's wildly untrue. The first person to see the risen Christ was actually Mary Magdalene. In fact, it's not even true that Peter was the first male disciple to see the risen Jesus. The first male disciple was John the Beloved. So what's going on there then?
For centuries, questions such as these could not be raised in large parts of the world without fear of persecution. It goes to the heart of the Church. Was St. Peter really the one chosen to start the Church? Is the Vatican the true resting place of his body? Early scientists were some of the first to question. With other religions growing in popularity, the Church had a lot at stake.
And the Catholic Church just took this position that we have to be the one faith. We can't have anybody else believing in these other gods or polytheism or some other type of God. It's got to be the Catholic Church or nothing. The Catholic Church took this position, I think, in its first maybe 400 years of existence, that they, at that time when there were also these other faiths competing for people's souls, and so to speak, that they wanted to be the one church that would dominate over all the other faiths that were out there.
Adding to the controversy is the Vatican's enormous financial wealth, and more importantly, how it was achieved.
I think the Vatican is secretive about its finances because of the controversy over how much money flows into the church. They don't want to detail how much money they have, how much money they're worth. In fact, it's really amazing, but I have found in my work as a journalist in this country that even local bishops, local priests, they only know their picture, their small piece of the puzzle. They do not have entree to general accounting numbers as to how much money or where it goes or who's getting it or anything else.
The Vatican has always been a very secretive place. There's even, well within living memory, there have been sort of great financial scandals involving the Vatican Bank and things like that.
This enormous collection of wealth has had one other unintentional consequence: making the job of Pope one of the most dangerous in the world. While Dan Brown's Angels and Demons plot revolved around the fictional assassination of a pope, his research was well based in historical fact.
Could a pope be murdered? Well, it's a question that Brown certainly brings up within Angels and Demons, and it's certainly something that undoubtedly has happened. Celestine V being a classic example, 5-inch nail in his head, maybe kind of gives that one away as a slightly suspicious circumstance.
Stephen Ostro, a professor of art history, has researched the early centuries of the Vatican, uncovering a legacy of persecution and violence.
The early popes were almost to a one martyred because they represented a tradition, a faith that was contrary to the Roman law. So if you go into St. Peter's, for example, all the piers of the main nave are adorned with portraits of the early popes, each and every one of whom was martyred for his faith. So popes have long been killed because they are not just religious but also political figures. And so, yes, there's been intrigue, yes, popes have been poisoned, murdered, martyred. But I think in the modern era, let's just say since the 17th century, it hasn't been quite so bad as it was in the early days.
The battles of the early church were over power, world domination, the same goal as other secret societies.
Scary times are good times for the church. The agenda of all secret societies that have a negative impact is to rule the masses. so that the masses become slaves. But it all starts with the idea of a few elite people looking down their noses at the rest of humanity.
This early history of the church was violent, and like other kingdoms of its time, the church hierarchy was filled with hidden agendas by groups competing for world power. A new word developed to describe the concealed schemes of this time.
Calling the church a pornocracy is an interesting use of the term. It's not a widely accepted or used term. It literally means government by harlots, by prostitutes, hence the root porno. And it specifically and historically refers to a time in the 10th century, beginning with a fairly inept pope named Sergius III, and a series of popes who ruled by less than moral means. Apparently Sergius I, for example, had a number of competing cardinals killed in order so that he could assume the papal throne. The term got applied then because of these very powerful women, members of the aristocratic noble families of Rome, who kind of held the strings on the papacy and determined who would be pope at any given point, hence the term applied then.
Much of this sordid history and internal secret battles is said to be sealed away in this building, 100 yards behind the Great Basilica on the Vatican grounds, the Archives. This sprawling complex is said to house the greatest collection of sacred books and folios in the world. Some have not been seen for centuries.
The Vatican libraries extend for approximately 50 miles of books. The collection is enormous.
I've been asked what's in the secret Vatican archives, and I must say, I don't know, because they're secret, and they have been secret for so many centuries.
In Angels and Demons, Robert Langdon manages to steal a historic document from the archives that he thinks will help find the location of a kidnapped cardinal. Could such a theft be committed? Paul Williams is a theologist and one of the very few researchers ever allowed to pass through the Vatican's tight security and examine its archives.
You can't enter with a jacket. You can't enter with an attaché case. You can't even carry a fountain pen. The only thing you can take with you is a graphite pencil and a notepad. When you enter the archives, a cleric will present exactly the document that you've requested. If they've agreed to give you that document, the cleric will remain with you while you study that document. There will be porters and guards behind you, so it would be absolutely impossible to take anything out of that room. Even if you were Harry Houdini, you just can't do it.
Such close attention to security and restricted access raises the question, is the Vatican hiding something in its archives? What secrets can be found on its 50 miles of shelf space?
There are rumoured to be some fabulous documents in there about the Second World War, about the Pope's involvement, or rather the Pope's non-involvement in the Holocaust and his failure to speak out against the Holocaust.
Of course, there must be truly secret Vatican archives, because the Church dozens and dozens of other Gospels, for example, that weren't included in the New Testament, that has stuff in them that would seriously undermine the Church if people knew about it. So presumably there are an awful lot of books that certainly researchers like me would give my eye teeth to see, hidden somewhere in the Vatican.
One of the secrets that is reportedly held here comes right from the pages of Angels and Demons. Suppressed historical documents, including unpublished writings and research by early scientists. Those writings could include materials of Galileo and Copernicus. Both were considered enemies of the Church. Both were linked by Dan Brown to the Illuminati.
When Galileo made his revelation that, hey, the Earth and the Moon and all the planets revolve around the Sun, number one, this was disturbing the orthodoxy of the Roman Church, and two, they probably were afraid that this would lend a lot of support to sun worship, which is one of the oldest, most primitive religions, and one that they were trying desperately to stamp out.
I think it's interesting that within Angels and Demons, it's not made implicit, it's not made clear which one is the angel and which one's the demon.
As Dan Brown asserts in his book, even though it's fiction, to claim that Galileo and Bernini were either part of the Illuminati or Freemasons, it's not so far-fetched, I don't think. It's certainly open to possibility. There were so many groups, secret groups at that time, it was just kind of the height of secret societies throughout Europe between the 1400s to the 1800s.
There's been an age-old war between church and science. It's gone back as far as the foundation of the church itself, and I think this is something that's inevitable when you have a group, a society, like the church, like the Christian church itself, putting down tenets and dogmas and doctrines that they say are absolute, that are immovable, that are truths. And you will also have people challenging those truths.
Did the Vatican's oppression of science and knowledge spur the formation of secret societies? Is the Illuminati one of them?
Like most persecuted and suppressed organizations, the Illuminati probably did go underground.
The Illuminati appeared late in the history of Europe. But where did they really come from? Some historians theorize that the Illuminati evolved out of a once powerful and legendary organization. One that once protected the Pope, but then was destroyed by order of the Pope. The Knights Templar, warrior priests. But were they really eliminated?
The Knights Templar started out as the Order of the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon.
The Knights Templar were purportedly to be in possession of the Holy Grail.
It was the year 1000. The Western world believed in the legend of the Holy Grail, a cup thought to hold the blood of Christ and his power. And now, a secret society of warrior monks allegedly found the Holy Grail. Through this legend and the power it conveyed, the Knights Templar became one of the most revered and feared secret societies that ever existed. Authors Stephen Ostrow and Devin Jackson, who have dedicated years of research into the Knights Templar, describe them as early defenders of the Vatican who eventually became its biggest threat.
They were ostensibly serving to free the roads for pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. They took up residence in the Temple of Solomon. They lived in the stables of the Temples of Solomon, and for about 8 years they conducted an excavation.
The Knights Templar were these warrior monks, and what they did was they sometimes served as the guards for the Pope, but what they largely did was that they guarded the route, the pilgrims' route and the crusaders' route on the way down to Jerusalem.
There were only 9 of them for about 9 years, so I don't think they could have done that, at least not very efficiently. They quite clearly had another agenda. They did seem to be looking for something in the Holy Land. They were very into secret knowledge.
Even though they took a vow of poverty, the knights began accumulating more wealth than many rulers of the day. Land, money, shipping. The knights began to finance monarchies as well as the Vatican.
The Knights Templar eventually became kind of a Templar Incorporated. They started the first branch banking, which means you could deposit your gold and silver in England and expect to take it out when you go to Jerusalem, so you wouldn't have to carry it along the highways. So they became the biggest property owner in Europe. At the same time, they owned the biggest fleet.
Their vast wealth and influence made the Templars fearless and intimidating. They bowed to no king or leader, and soon, not even the Pope. Their wealth, however, might not have been their biggest threat. Historian Lynn Picknett believes the Knights may have started a new and competing religion.
Knights Templar were accused of spitting and trampling on the cross in secret ceremonies and of worshipping a bearded, severed head. And they certainly had a great reverence for John the Baptist, overtly. And what was the significance of this? We discovered that the Knights Templar, when they were in the Middle East, met a group that was known as the Church of John of the East. And it was a group called the Mandeans, who originated around Judea, Egypt, 2,000 years ago, and they were John the Baptist's followers.
The Knights might have been following a cult, sometimes called Johnites. But it's what Picknett says next that might have doomed the fearless Knights.
They rant and rave against Jesus, who they say was a false prophet, who was a schismatic from John's religion, and certainly it does seem, I mean, modern scholars have found out that it's very likely that Jesus was actually a follower, started off as a follower of John the Baptist.
Whatever the reason, the Templars soon grew more secretive, holding surreptitious meetings in hidden locations, much like Dan Brown's path of illumination. A growing allegiance to John the Baptist, along with their wealth and power, made the Knights the greatest threat the Vatican had ever seen.
The Knights Templar refused to acknowledge superiority of anybody. They were becoming amazingly arrogant.
They existed for about 2 centuries as an incredibly powerful, in every sense, order. And then they met with a very kind of sudden, abrupt and rather nasty end at the beginning of the 14th century when first the King of France and then the Pope turned on them.
Eventually the Templar Order became so big that they started to arouse the jealousy of the French king and also the ire of the population. They became regarded in Sir Walter Scott's term as haughty as a Templar, meaning that they just were so proud they could do anything they want, and so this aroused the people to be against them.
Question's been debated ever since exactly what the motivation for closing this order down was. The standard reason that's given is that the King of France simply wanted their money. The reasons they were given at the time for them being suppressed was that they were the heretics and blasphemers.
On October 12, 1307, the Knights Templar saw the end coming. Historians are convinced that they managed to spirit away their vast riches and collected treasure just ahead of the advancing armies of the King of France.
These wagon trains full of treasure were brought to the harbor of La Rochelle, and from there they were loaded on 17 Templar ships, which basically disappeared from history. The next day, Friday the 13th, armies of French soldiers arrested all the Templars at every temple that they could find.
And then killed them at the stake. Many were burned alive. To this day, some 700 years later, many people still fear Friday the 13th. But by 1307, when the last Grand Knight of the Templars was burned, the purge was complete. King Philip of France now had the funds to launch his war against King Edward I of England. But was the purge successful? Historical authorities like Jim Marrs think otherwise.
It wasn't very effective because the Knights Templars had plenty of warning that this was going to happen. In fact, they only rounded up a handful of them. Most of them had fled or had simply changed clothes and blended themselves into the general population.
From here, the mystery deepens. What happened to the surviving Knights Templar with their immense treasure and contempt for the Church? Did their descendants become the Illuminati? With the Templars supposedly vanquished in the late 1300s, the Vatican regained its standing as the world's most powerful institution. But over time, a more formidable threat to the Vatican came into being: science.
Dan Brown's Illuminati are a society of essentially scientists, is the word he uses. It wasn't the word that was used at that time. That was formed in the 1500s so that they could pursue their work and share their work in secret because of the Church's attitude to the work they were doing.
Betty Ann Brown, an art history professor, feels that early scientists, astronomers, and even artists were the first to challenge the Vatican's view on man and nature.
The Church has functioned to explain the meaning of existence in a particular way. And science's explanation has often conflicted with the Church's. Certainly, that was the reason that Galileo was a threat to the Church. Because if he suggests that the earth is not the center of the universe, that the earth revolves around the sun, he's challenging the Catholic tenet that the earth was central.
There were supporters of Galileo within the Church who disagreed with the view that if he was right, it proved these passages of the Bible to be wrong, you know, on theological grounds. So yes, there were those who backed him, but obviously it's the Pope's word that goes at any given time.
The Renaissance became a dangerous time to be a scientist. Many paid with their lives, including Giordano Bruno, a brilliant scientist and a follower of Copernicus. He was imprisoned in the very same church as was Dan Brown's heroine, Castile di Sant'Angelo.
One of the prime examples of the Church coming down hard on scientific thinkers was the story of Bruno, who was a bit of an extremist in some of his views.
Bruno was famous throughout Western Europe for developing memory skills, a sensational theory in 1576. And because he believed, like Copernicus, that the earth revolved around the sun, he became an enemy of the Church. The Church taught that the universe revolved around the earth.
And so the Church arrested him and imprisoned him for almost 8 years, I believe, and tried to convince him to recant his teachings, and he refused, and in the year 1600 he was burned at the stake.
Galileo could have faced the same fate. Like Bruno, he too was put on trial, twice, for his scientific studies. These trials were a central part of Angels and Demons' plot.
The story of Galileo is very often misunderstood. There are two trials regarding Galileo. One occurred in 1616, in which he was taken before church officials because he upheld the Copernican theory at that time, that the earth revolved around the sun and that the earth was not the center of the universe. At that time, during his first trial, he was brought there by the scientists from Italy. Trial in 1616, he recanted that, and he said, oh yeah, I agree now with Ptolemy that the earth is the center of the universe. Well, he went back to the university and continued teaching that the earth revolved around the sun. He was brought before the Inquisition in 1632. The trial was held in 1633. There's a common conception that Galileo was beaten to his knees and forced to recant and thrown into a dungeon and starved. All these things are not true. Galileo was, at the time of his trial, was living in the Villa Medici. He was living in the lap of luxury. As soon as he recanted in 1633, his sentence of a term in prison was nullified by the Pope, and the Pope immediately gave him a pension to live on for the rest of his life, which he did, and a nice position.
Did this persecution drive Galileo to join an underground movement? And as Dan Brown suggests, the Illuminati? Historian Clive Prince has the answer.
Galileo couldn't have been a member of the Illuminati because it didn't exist in his day. As to whether he was a member of a similar society, there's no evidence either of his involvement in any kind of movement like that, or his inclination to be involved in anything like that.
Still, many leading artists and scientists of the day began joining secret societies, like the Priori of Sion, familiar to readers of the Da Vinci Code.
As far as I can tell, Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton were both members of the Priori of Sion, but definitely with da Vinci, he was into a lot of strange stuff. He was kind of a polymath, and so it makes sense that he would be into that, and he was very much into, in terms of his paintings and his drawings, there was a lot of stuff that's people still don't know exactly what it means, and it probably points to maybe his membership in this or some other group of secret people.
Well, in Angels and Demons, the idea behind much of this is that you look at people like Bernini, the sculptor, and Raphael, and Dan Brown postulates or puts forward this idea that they may have been members of this secret organization, the Illuminati. My research has shown that that is undoubtedly not the case. People like Bernini and Raphael were God-fearing folk.
They were kind of coming around at that period of the Age of Reason and Enlightenment, and when a lot of scientists such as Galileo were pursuing knowledge that was outside the purview of the Catholic Church and using rationality and scientific method to get at what they saw as deeper, larger, grander truths.
Those larger, grander truths were sought after by more than just Renaissance scientists.
This is a war that's been going on for a long time for control of the planet. How do you fight such a war?
Rome is today, and has been for centuries, the seat of the Catholic Church, which means the fundamental center of the Christian faith. It is a mixture of many other sources from Egypt, from Africa, and from all over the planet.
Symbols from other ancient lands cover the city of Rome. It's one reason Dan Brown set Angels and Demons there. Another is its massive treasure of artwork. Art historian Betty Brown suggests both were used to convey covert messages. Some might have even been on the fictitious path of illumination.
Bernini, as the Illuminati artist, used Egyptian motifs so much in his work, and that's because there was, at the time that he was working, very much a vogue for things Egyptian, for Egyptian symbols.
Since he chose Bernini as the central character in Rome, it's particularly good. The Baroque period was a time in which Western culture was centered around the production of images. Rome was the picture-making center of the entire civilization. Bernini was a superstar on that stage.
Superstar might be an understatement. Bernini was one of the most famous artists of all time. Working in the 1600s, he designed the famous columns in St. Peter's Square and the 140 intimidating saints that stare down from him.
Bernini as an artist may well have actually embedded within much of his artwork certain symbols and ideas that the church would have seen as kind of in opposition to their standpoint at the time. But I think that just like Raphael, Bernini's markers or symbols themselves, we're really just talking about these new scientific ideas, the ideas of Copernicus and Galileo, and incorporating them within the artwork.
The Church of Santa Maria del Popolo is a site, like many churches in Rome, that has a deep history. It's an important place for the Illuminati, if the Illuminati master is going to be Bernini, because it has two major Bernini sculptures. It has a Bernini sculpture of Daniel and a pairing of an angel and Habakkuk. And the angel has come to Habakkuk to tell him to rescue or help Daniel. And the angel is pointing in one direction. Habakkuk, resisting for a moment, is pointing in another direction. And Dan Brown uses the angel and Habakkuk sculpture to suggest that the angel is pointing in the direction of the next clue. So that's a first major step on his fictional path of the Illuminati.
Another location on Dan Brown's path of illumination? Bernini's Four Rivers Fountain. It's the southwestern tip of the path's cross, over the Tiber River. And at the center of this Baroque masterwork is this, a large obelisk. Did Bernini purposefully place this pagan object here as some type of signal?
The obelisk at the center of the Four Rivers Fountain is another one of the ancient obelisks that were brought to Rome, and it lay in another side of the city, but under dirt and years of debris. The pope who patronized Bernini and created that fountain was Innocent X, who wanted to create a monument at the center of that piazza, which was, in a sense, his kind of family turf. His family's palace is right adjacent to it. Wanted a monument that marked the center of the piazza and glorified him and the church as well.
An interesting question, though, is why Bernini used Egyptian motifs so much in his work.
It's a question that has intrigued conspiracy theorists for centuries.
In the Fountain of the Four Rivers, each of the human figures represents a river, and so it's accompanied by symbols designating which river that is. Those are the more overt symbols, but Bernini could have hidden all manner of other little tricks in there had he chosen to do so.
But it isn't the fountain that has most historians perplexed. It's this sculpture, often considered Bernini's masterpiece. And it's right on the eastern end of Dan Brown's path of illumination. It hardly seems like an accident.
The Ecstasy of St. Teresa is one of Bernini's most extraordinary works. The sculptural group is the centerpiece of an entire ensemble, a chapel that Bernini designed for the Cornaro family, a wealthy Venetian family. And it illustrates or gives form to one of the most remarkable passages in her writings that describes one of her many encounters with the divine.
It's the tip of the arrow that allegedly holds an Illuminati clue: fire, one of the four elements. The Illuminati were early scientists. Earth, wind, fire, and water were the elements with which they worked. And in Dan Brown's book, each was used to kill a cardinal. Did the Illuminati truly use their most important symbols for such a frightening means?
Teresa of Avila is a fabulous woman from Christian history. Santa Teresa reformed the Carmelite order, allowing women who weren't incredibly privileged to enter the convent by basically working their way through rather than coming in with such an immense dowry that it would pay for their room and board for their entire lives. She traveled all over Spain founding the convents, and during her life had several visionary experiences.
St. Teresa of Avila was in many ways the poster child of the Catholic Reformation, and her experience, her ecstasy, there was this new emphasis on having an emotional experience of piety, an emotional experience of God and of Jesus.
This artist outlived 8 popes, 8 benefactors. This allowed Bernini to create much of the most valued artwork throughout the Vatican, including the famous St. Peter's Square. But another Renaissance artist may also have left similar secret messages in his works: Raphael. Only it wasn't with obelisks or spears of fire. And one anchors yet another arm of the cross on the path of illumination.
Well, the pyramids in the Chigi Chapel are fairly unique in terms of Renaissance tomb imagery and form. They were actually designed by Raphael, who was the architect and designer of the chapel in the 16th century, the early 16th century. And they were very much meant to evoke the grandeur of ancient Rome and earlier civilizations still. When Raphael designed those tombs, he was very much thinking about the symbolic meaning of the pyramid, going back to Egyptian and ancient Roman culture. And in its form, it embodied kind of perfection on the one hand, and on the other, the idea of salvation and eternity.
Dan Brown appropriated this site for the Illuminati as yet another clue: the element of earth. Does this make Raphael a conspirator?
I think it's highly possible that any of these incredible creative geniuses could have been a member of a secret society. Certainly could have been true for Raphael, certainly could have been true for Bernini.
And I think that Bernini and Raphael and many of the artists at the time would have been seen in modern terms as reformers. They still relied fundamentally upon the church. They were still God-fearing folk. They would have seen these ideas, the very idea of a secret society, as anathema, but they were reformers, and they wanted to bring forward some of these new scientific ideas. And I think that's what Dan Brown is really getting at with a lot of his work within Angels and Demons.
While Bernini and Raphael lived long before the Illuminati were known, other symbols on the path of illumination may have true connections to secret societies.
Symbolically, Egypt is the source for the Illuminati symbols that are so significant in the mystery of angels and demons.
Angels and Demons starts with Robert Langdon, the main character, dreaming of Egypt. I think this is Dan Brown using this device within the novel to draw us into the idea that Egypt and Egyptian symbolism is going to play a very important part in this book.
In both Rome and Vatican City, numerous Egyptian obelisks like these sit in open display. Their origins are pagan, yet here they are in one of the most religious sites on earth. The reason they are here goes back to the very beginning of modern Christianity.
The obelisks within Rome seem odd on the surface. You walk around Rome, you see obelisks. There are actually 13 obelisks within Rome. These obelisks account for more obelisks than are actually standing within Egypt.
In Angels and Demons, the obelisks also help to form the path of illumination that Robert Langdon uncovers. Professor Eric Johnson is a religious history scholar at UCLA. He suggests there's a reason that Egyptian mysticism was very influential in Christian-dominated Europe, and why such symbols would have been used by secret societies.
There is a fascination with Egyptian culture, or at least Egyptian philosophy, during the Renaissance. Renaissance humanists thought that the Egyptians were the source of very, very ancient wisdom that had been lost, and so there was this attempt to recover this ancient knowledge and ancient wisdom.
I think the obelisk in St. Peter's Square weighs about 180,000 tons, and so they had to construct massive casings in order to house it, to put it on a kind of causeway and move it, even if it was just several hundred meters. It was a colossal undertaking, thousands of men, horses, and you name it, in order to achieve the movement.
It is at the foot of this obelisk where one of Dan Brown's most gruesome murders takes place. The final clue is left by Bernini, who created this square in 1656 to hold 300,000, a staggering number for its day, and a testament to the power of the church. It is this elliptical relief laid in the center of the square by the obelisk, the West Ponente, wind.
This stands in St. Peter's Square. It's on one side of the grand obelisk there in the square, the West Ponente, and it really just represents the idea of the wind blowing from the west wind. There are certain Christian symbolic references here that you could make and you could put into that.
What Dan Brown had in his book about the Illuminati, what makes them a little bit more on the edge, a darker edge of things, is the fact that a lot of their symbology and the way they went about things and some of their so-called rituals, they borrowed a lot of their symbology and that kind of stuff from Egyptians, from Babylonians, which everybody was doing that at the time.
I would probably catch some flack for saying this, but it's quite obvious to any student of the Bible that the Bible, of course, on which Christianity is based, is actually a hodgepodge of ancient oral traditions, old stories. I give you one classic example is the story of Noah and the ark and taking in the animals. This is a story that dates back to the Sumerian tablets that predate the Bible by probably at least 4,000 years. And in the Sumerian tablets, we have the exact same story.
The church appropriated many symbols. There are some scholars who believe that the Christian cross symbol is actually an appropriation of the Egyptian Ankh symbol, which, as you know, is like a cross but with a rounded top, but it was worn as crosses are worn today. The image of Christ as Good Shepherd, the young boy holding the sheep, that's an appropriated symbol as well from ancient times.
Egyptian religion and what we know as modern-day Christianity only fundamentally differ in a few points, really. Egyptian religion was a religion of symbolism. Christianity, you could argue, is a religion of symbolism too. We have the symbol of the cross, for instance, which is probably the best-known symbol that we have in the world today.
Experts suggest that one major difference separates Christianity from Egyptian religion. the belief in dualism, especially good and evil. This theme runs throughout Angels and Demons. It also accurately describes the epic battle between the Church and science, between the Illuminati and organized religion.
The Egyptians really didn't see things in forms of black and white. They didn't see things as a yin and yang type of scenario. It was shades of grey. You had to have one to have the other. Order and chaos, they must sit side by side. Horus and Seth, these two characters from the Egyptian pantheon of gods, must be together in order to give us completeness in the world.
But the Christian idea is that you have the good God and you have the devil, and that, you know, one is ultimately totally good and one is totally bad. Well, even Set, the ancient Egyptian god, wasn't totally bad. He had his place in the pantheon of gods and the place in the welfare of men, even representing that part of men and women and representing the balance. The Egyptians were very big on balance, whereas Christianity isn't.
In Christian elements of religion, you really do have a definite black and white, and it's used in a very different sense to this idea of balance. You have heaven and hell, you have God and the devil, and it's a case of you must take your choice. You must pick, are you with us or against us? And it's this element to Christianity that really is one of the most fundamental differences to the earlier Egyptian religious iconography.
So this is another way in which Rome transformed itself into a sacred center for the entire empire, and so all the gods that were venerated in the empire were venerated in that temple. Later on, after Christianity becomes legalized and then later becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, it was normal for a lot of these old pagan temples to be reconverted to become Christian.
It's one of these very pagan temples that became one of the most famous basilicas in Rome, the Pantheon. Hundreds of thousands of tourists flock here every year, yet few likely know that when they look up, they are looking at a demon hole. Many now, however, may think of it as an Illuminati landmark.
Pantheon has a large hole in its roof, and there's actually a false trail that leads Langdon and Vittoria to the tomb of Raphael.
This so-called demon's hole in the temple shows yet again a pagan symbol remade as a Christian symbol. Another example of dualism, good versus evil.
They think one of the murders is actually going to take place there. It doesn't take place there. But what's interesting is that they bring into this part of the story the idea of the demon's hole. And this demon hole they equate with the roof of the Pantheon.
Historian Simon Cox believes that the path of illumination may be real, at least in one sense.
I think the path of illumination that Dan Brown highlights in his book is real. It's something that has been used throughout history, although maybe not in the context that Brown is actually bringing it forward within Angels and Demons. The idea behind neophytes, behind initiates actually walking a path, metaphorical or real, is something that we do find symbolically throughout history.
As the Vatican continued to rule, evidence suggests that the Illuminati stayed underground for centuries. Their goal of achieving enlightenment through science would slowly take a dark turn. A grand conspiracy was planned, a plan for world domination.
Well, we've all heard that knowledge is power. But secret knowledge is even more powerful. And the Illuminati, if they still call themselves that, is a movement whose basic philosophy is the end justifies the means.
Conspiracy theorists have concluded that the modern-day Illuminati are a powerful entity in the world today, even if they no longer carry the name.
They will do anything to further their agenda. Kill, maim, destroy, lie, cheat, steal, whatever. And this is quite effective because they will pose as anything. They're liberals, they're conservatives, they're fascists, they're communists, they're Democrats, they're Republicans, they're anything that will further their agenda, and this makes for a very, very powerful and effective secret conspiracy.
Theorists like Jim Marrs and Paul Williams suggest that the Illuminati's call to arms came with the formation of the most controversial secret society of the last 300 years. The Freemasons, an ancient sect of builders and stonecutters that may date back to Egypt.
Freemason was actually a half French, half Anglo term, and it just meant somebody that was free, or frere as in brother, and a mason, which was actually in the building arts. Later on, when they could not be Templars anymore, these masons banded together, and they weren't just masons, they were anybody in the building arts. They would form lodges, and so if a brother mason came from another lodge into your town, you would be responsible to help give him shelter, give him food, and if possible, give him a job to do.
Others, like investigative journalist John Rappaport, believe that the Knights Templar never were destroyed. They simply went underground for centuries. But now, Rappaport suggests, the Knights have finally re-emerged and possibly infiltrated the Freemasons.
Freemasons, to me, evolved out of the Knights Templar. Knights Templar were partially destroyed by edict of the Pope and the King of France, fled the scene, reformed themselves as a kind of secret society called the Masons, put their Templar past behind them publicly so that no one hopefully would discover that this was a reformulation.
When the Knights Templars came back from the Holy Land with all of their newfound wealth and knowledge, they proceeded to work closely with primitive but existing stonemason guilds. And these were stonemasons who would clump together to form a kind of a union and then collectively work to build cathedrals and churches. And so it was the stonemason guilds that were the genesis of the Freemasonry.
But the Freemasons as an organization has survived for an incredibly long time, given that even though they didn't set themselves up in direct opposition to the church had a huge fear of that Gnostic-based belief that you could attain this knowledge on your own.
Like the Templars before them, the Freemasons became an enemy of the Vatican, who views them as a threat to its sovereignty.
Freemasonry has been the target of 17 separate degrees by the church. It is outlawed by the church, and members that of the Catholic Church that become Freemasons are subject to excommunication.
You cannot be a Catholic and a Mason. From the time of its inception, Freemasonry remained anathema to the Catholic Church.
In the United States, it is believed that the Freemasons became established as early as the Revolutionary War. More importantly, author Jim Marrs and others believe they quickly became political players in the fledgling government.
According to the Masons themselves, they played a very, very big role. The Boston Tea Party reportedly took place by members of a Masonic lodge who completed their lodge meeting and then went out and dressed up as Indians and dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor.
The number of America's founding fathers who were also Freemasons might be a startling fact to many.
In the United States during colonial times, Freemasonry was the grease of the economy, that in many cities you had to become a Mason in order to do business. Benjamin Franklin understood that when he went to Philadelphia, that by becoming a Freemason, his newspaper and his printing press would get jobs from the city. John Hancock knew that in Boston, where about a third of the people depended on him for their income, he could trust people if they were Masons, so he would not give a job to someone that wasn't a Mason. George Washington was actually told in a letter by his brother, if he wants to get surveying jobs, to become a Mason, and that would facilitate him getting those jobs.
And of the 57 some odd signers of the Declaration of Independence, at least 50 of them were known to be Masons. So there's really not much question that the Masons played a very prominent role in the founding of America.
Perhaps it was coincidence, But the founding of the Illuminati in Bavaria appears to come full circle with the founding of America. Did the Illuminati find a sympathetic secret society in the newly formed United States?
The Illuminati were founded in a kind of a banner year of 1776. That's their date, and May 1st, no less, kind of international communism, May Day. And they were called the bearers of light, Illuminati, from illumination. You kind of find this knowledge about yourself or information through the light.
There have in fact been several Illuminati groups. The best known one is the Bavarian Illuminati group, and it's best known because its ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, if that sounds familiar, they became fundamental to the Enlightenment that appealed to the founding fathers of this country.
With Freemasonry firmly established in both the United States and Europe, the Illuminati reportedly began to secretly expand their power base by infiltrating Masonic lodges.
But in 1782, at the Wilhelmsbad Convention, the Illuminati rolled themselves into the Knights Templars and into their creation, the Freemasonry. And this is where the merging of the Illuminati and the Freemasons took place.
Some of those lodges have been infiltrated, for example, by Adam Weishaupt, who formed the Illuminati in 1776. He thought a very good way to spread the word was to simply infiltrate and take over certain already established Masonic lodges. And if it is internationally controlled from one point, and if that point has some very dark agenda.
Even founding father George Washington, a Freemason, openly feared the Illuminati's infiltration.
Interestingly, George Washington said that he believed in the Illuminati conspiracy, he said, but it's nothing to do with Freemasonry. Although he distanced Freemasonry from it, he himself actually believed in this Illuminati conspiracy.
A small group of people would have to run Paradise to make sure that it is maintained. The idea was, we'll present this concept of the abolition of private property. That will be our front. There's a lot of people that would love that as a dream because they feel that that would create true equality.
But these utopian ideals masked a drive for complete control of world events. Could that drive lead them to take over the United States? While the Illuminized Freemasons were expanding their ranks globally, the Roman Catholic Church had slowly declined in wealth, power, and influence. In order to survive, the Vatican was forced to compromise. Some critics say they made covert deals with the devil. Others believe it might have resurrected assassinations of modern-day popes.
Well, first with the Lateran Treaty of Mussolini, and then to a reported secret concord between Hitler and the Vatican. There were accommodations made prior to World War II between the fascists and the church. That basically it was kind of, we'll leave you alone if you'll leave us alone. That's why there were no prominent outcry against the atrocities of Hitler and the Nazis by the church.
This alleged secret infiltration of the Vatican by outside powers may have saved them from ruin. However, some say it also made them a co-conspirator in the genocide that was to follow.
Pope Pius XI signed the Concordat with Hitler and the Concordat with Mussolini. He had promoted these two fascist regimes. Toward the end of his pontificate, he lived to recant these views. He knew that he was wrong. He saw the herding of the Jewish populations throughout Germany and Poland into ghettos, the creation of concentration camps, the persecution of Catholic clerics throughout Germany.
By 1939, Pope Pius XI could no longer abide by the clandestine agreement he had made with Italian dictator Mussolini. He decided to separate the Church from the fascists. It would be the last decision he ever made.
Just on the eve of World War II, Pope Pius XI announced that he was not happy with these concordants that had been reached with the fascists, Mussolini and Hitler, and was threatening to come forward and expose these deals that had been made between the church and the fascists, but then he died suddenly.
The sudden death of Pius XI killed the plan to break the Vatican's alliance with the fascists. Just like popes being murdered and martyred in the Middle Ages, once again, the job of being pope had become deadly. Scholars today still raise disturbing questions about the pope's death.
As soon as he died, the papal chambers was entered by two people, just two. One was Cardinal Pacelli, who later became Pope Pius XII, who was the engineer of the Concordat with Hitler. The second was the Vatican physician.
Cardinal Pacelli and the Vatican physician immediately ordered Pius XI's body to be embalmed. The Church had never allowed this practice before. Also, the Vatican did not allow an autopsy to be performed, raising further suspicions. Pius XI's death remains a mystery to this day.
There is reason to believe that Italian fascists poisoned him. But of course, as with most conspiracies, you keep them covered up not through absolute covering up of facts, but through obfuscation. There's so much claim and counterclaim and controversy that most people just finally get tired of it and turn away.
This was not the last time in recent history that secrets, cover-ups, even deaths would scandalize the Church. On May 5, 1998, Italians woke to shocking headlines. Sangue in Vaticano. Violence had erupted within the Vatican, one of the most secret and protected cities on earth. Someone had been murdered within its walls.
On May 4th, 1998, a nun made her way through the barracks of the Swiss Guard in the Vatican and discovered the bodies of the commander of the Swiss Guard, Alois Estermann, his wife Gladys, and a young Lance Corporal, Cedric Tournay. The Vatican, a few hours later, said that the young Lance Corporal had shot the commander and his wife before turning the gun on himself.
What was behind this horrific crime? Had the fortress of the Vatican been infiltrated? Was it part of a larger plot to overthrow the Church? Dan Brown couldn't have written the ensuing cover-up better.
It was only 4 hours after the bodies were discovered that the Vatican announced that, according to its official version, the Lance Corporal had killed the commander and his wife and then killed himself in a fit of madness. We weren't told what the basis for this conclusion was.
The terse nature of the Vatican statement about the Swiss Guard murders only inflamed the story more.
Basically, the Italian newspapers had no idea what to make of all this, and all they had to go on were a few lines from the Vatican. So, of course, that's where the question started.
What appeared on the surface as a bizarre crime in one of the most protected secret societies on Earth may have been more political than previously known.
Now, Cedric Tournay was made out to be a madman, an alcoholic, a drug addict by the Vatican, but the truth is that he was actually quite a typical Swiss Guard. He was dedicated to the Pope, he swore to sacrifice his life if necessary for the Pope, and he wanted to act as a bodyguard for the Pope. And all these expectations that he harbored in him were, of course, turned out to be illusions.
But in another twist, investigative journalist Devin Jackson finds a possible link between the Swiss Guard, this elite army sworn to protect the Pope and Church, and a secret society from the past, the Knights Templar. The very knights who once guarded the Pope were destroyed by the Pope. Did this investigation expose the resurgence of this secret society? It's a case that never has been solved. And like their predecessors, the Knights Templar, the Swiss Guard are tightly keeping their secrets.
Despite the huge pressure for a public investigation and the public wanting to find out more about the cause of the murders, the Vatican battened down its hatches completely. It refused an offer of help from the Italian Interior Ministry. It refused offers of help from other Italian crime experts. The morning following the murders, all the Swiss Guards were gathered together by the chaplain, and they were made to swear silence on the affair, on anything they knew about the protagonists involved.
While the murders cast a more scrutinizing light on the Swiss Guards, their undying dedication to the Pope is beyond dispute. In many ways, they are just as secretive as the Vatican.
The Swiss Guard is a secretive institution like any department inside the Vatican. The officers, the men of the Swiss Guard, have to swear an oath of loyalty to the Church, and it's inculcated into them that includes defending the interests of the Church at all times.
Though Dan Brown depicts the Swiss Guards as a sophisticated private army in Angels and Demons, experts tell a different story.
It's fair to characterize the Swiss Guard as a tourist attraction, a paper tiger, rather than a crack fighting force.
Because of their tangible connection with the Vatican, some even suspect that papal foes, like Knights Templar, infiltrated the Swiss Guards centuries ago.
When the Knights Templars took off their tunics and rolled themselves into the general population, it stands to reason that they would insinuate themselves into positions of power, to include the Swiss Guards around the Vatican, to include the secret societies. They probably infiltrated many walks of life.
The Vatican has always been rumored to have a secret service, but it's not an intelligence system as we know it in other Western countries. It's basically a network of information, a prodigious network of information, because it's based on priests in Italy, but of course all over the world, and all sorts of religious institutions who bring in a flow of information to the Vatican. But there are some blind spots, and one of them is terrorism, and that's why the Vatican have to rely on information from people like the CIA, the French Secret Service, or even the Italian Secret Service. My key conclusion after watching and talking to the Swiss Guards is that they're not equipped to protect the Pope.
The biggest threat to the Vatican, though, may not be from terrorists. Have secret societies infiltrated the Church itself? Some believe that they have, and that there is a money trail leading to more murders at the Vatican. Perhaps even of another pope.
It would be most instructive if everyone was to study the P2 scandal in Italy back during the administration of Ronald Reagan back in the 80s. P2 stands for Propaganda Dua, which is the name of a Masonic lodge in Italy. They said they were financed through Illuminized Freemasons in Switzerland, known as the Gnomes of Zurich. It was a heck of a story, and it was big news in Europe, but over in America, we barely got to hear much of anything about it.
The Propaganda Dua had close business relations with the Vatican Bank, which was headed by Chicago-born Archbishop Thomas Marcinkus. Eventually, several high-ranking cardinals and bishops became members of the Masonic-led P2.
But here we have it in the 1960s, a secret Masonic organization that became incredibly powerful, with tentacles throughout the world, and you had over 121 Catholic hierarchs. I'm talking about archbishops, bishops, cardinals, members of the society.
By 1978, the newly appointed Pope John Paul I became aware of the Vatican's relationship with P2. He began an investigation, but he would not live to see it completed. Did the trail from the Knights Templar to the Illuminati and finally to the Masons somehow lead to John Paul's premature death? Historian Clive Prince believes it could have been an inside job.
That many people have suspected that that was a result of some kind of faction within, within the church, within the Curia, the church's civil service, if you like, that didn't want this man to be pope because of financial scandals that were going on at the time that they thought he might uncover.
A few years after the death of John Paul I, the Vatican was swept up in the Ambrosiano affair, one of the world's biggest banking scandals, which led to another bizarre death.
The P2 were also very big into banking, and around this time, the bank Ambrosio, one of the largest banks in Italy, and it was called the Vatican Bank, failed. The head of the bank was a person named Roberto Calvi, who was found hanging from the Blackfriars Bridge in London with stones in his pocket, kind of symbolic of a Masonic assassination rather than a simple hanging.
A Masonic rule says that a traitor should be dangled before the rising tide, which he was, and a traitor should be assassinated with the marks of Masonry, the group that he had betrayed, ergo the 5 bricks within his pockets.
While the assassination of a pope is fiction in Angels and Demons, the world watched in horror as a real assassination attempt of Pope John Paul was broadcast live on television. Even today, the question remains, was it a lone gunman, or was there a larger plot?
The assassination attempt against Pope John Paul II in May 1981 in St. Peter's Square is the only murder attempt in recent times. He was surrounded by Vatican security officials, including senior officers of the Swiss Guard.
The attempted assassination of John Paul II back in 1981, that it wasn't another case of a lone gunman, this guy Ali Akka, who was a Muslim, that it involved both the KGB through some weird, still shady Bulgarian connection.
Did Pope John Paul II's strong stance against communism incite the plot to assassinate him? Was his attacker part of an ancient secret society called the Assassins, which have been linked to the Knights Templar?
Ronald Reagan and John Paul II set up this agreement where they were in a battle. It was kind of toward the end of the Cold War. So they wanted to get rid of communism, and the liberation theologists, which were all in South America and Central America at that time, at the height of their controversial rise, Reagan said, if you help me defeat communism, I'll do what I can to kind of keep the liberation theology movement, down there and allow you to keep more control over those people. It's documented that Reagan and John Paul II, as the head of the Vatican, were going to try and do what they could to stamp out communism. So naturally, the Soviet Union felt threatened enough to perhaps use this Bulgarian connection to off the Pope.
If there was a conspiracy to kill John Paul II, the Vatican's perpetual secrecy effectively killed the investigation into the case.
We have the case just after the attempted murder of Pope John Paul II in 1981, when the Italian authorities tried to find out information from the church about what they might have known about the run-up to that attempted assassination. But there, the church refused to give any information to the magistrates, so much so that one Italian public prosecutor accused the Vatican of placing a tombstone on his inquiry.
But it wasn't just the Vatican that was threatened. Reportedly, the Illuminati had infiltrated the Freemasons. And across the ocean, in a prosperous America, the Freemasons were surprisingly aggressive at infiltrating the government of the United States, eventually reaching its highest levels.
To the question which presidents were Mason, it's more which presidents were not Masons. People up to George Bush and Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Reagan, it's just a laundry list. Just about every president has been a Freemason. It's just funny to think of who the Freemasons have been or are, like the astronaut Buzz Aldrin or John Wayne or Bob Hope or W.C. Fields, people that you never, it's like, what are they getting out of being a Freemason? And it's a fraternal organization. And this is where the Freemasons have been at odds.
Franklin Roosevelt was one of them that did reach the highest level of Masonry, and he worked his way up for a long time in Masonry. Gerald Ford might have been given the title strictly as an honorary basis, but some Masons believe as many as 1/3 of the presidents of the United States were Freemasons.
During Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, a subtle change in the $1 bill is thought to have signaled the arrival of a powerful secret society in the United States.
One of the things Dan Brown mentions in his books is the Masonic imagery on the dollar bill, and there's much to that. We have the Great Seal, which has a lot of Masonic imagery, such as the arrows and the olive branch. Here we have the all-seeing eye of knowledge at the top of the pyramid, but it's separated from the rest of the pyramid. And this is Illuminati imagery indicating that they alone have this knowledge and that all the rest of us are down here on the lower part of the pyramid.
Treasury Secretary Henry Wallace, who according to Simon Cox was a Freemason, added Masonic symbols to the Great Seal of the United States. He also added these frightening words.
The term Novus Ordo Seclorum actually means the New World Order. Masonry calls this God the Great Architect.
So, in other words, we have New World Order right here on our dollar bills, and yet most people are unaware of this.
The dollar bill might be just the beginning of evidence that the long trail of the Knights Templar to the Illuminati and now to the Freemasons has infiltrated the government of the world's largest free nation.
The Washington Monument is an obelisk. It's in the form of an Egyptian structure that basically has the same meaning. It was originally for the god Osiris, but it's just a sign of any god and the power of that god. The whole layout of Washington, D.C. is done to a sacred architecture. The Capitol building, the White House, and the Washington Monument are the three most important pieces there.
The most startling evidence of Illuminati influence is with the Bilderberg Commission, arguably one of the most powerful groups in the world who many suspect of controlling the world's economy and even its governments.
The Bilderbergers came along in 1954, I think. They were founded by another Freemason, this guy Prince Bernard, who was part of this Merovingian dynasty, as he claims, also affiliated with the Nazis. They used to meet in this hotel in the Netherlands called the Hotel Bilderberg. So they just started calling them the Bilderbergers. At one of their later meetings, David Rockefeller, who a lot of people see him as this huge kind of master puppet, kind of pulling the strings of world leaders, he proposed the idea at a Bilderberger meeting that we should have a commission, which later came to be called the Trilateral Commission, which is, coincidentally, there are three parts of the pyramid.
The purpose of the Bilderberg Group was a united Europe. Started with a common market. You now have the European Union that is desperately trying to get its member nations to ratify a constitution that will mean that the already top-heavy governments of these individual countries in Europe will now be run by a super top-heavy organization called the European Union. Bureaucrats will run all of Europe. There will be no borders. The rule of the few over the many.
There's a great deal of secrecy, especially with the Bilderbergers. There's a great deal of privacy of what goes on within the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. And the fact that they want to try and shape the world as they see it, that's what is best for the world, and we know how to do that. That's what leads to lumping them in with the New World Order, the pyramid, the eye in the pyramid, lumping them in with Masonic traditions.
The Vatican is saved at the end of Angels and Demons. But does the fight between science and the Church continue today?
I've been asked in the struggle between the Illuminati and the Church, who's winning? And it's hard to say because this is a sub rosa conflict. You don't read about it in your newspapers or your news magazines, and you don't see it on television. But stepping back and taking the long view, I think you find that the influence of the Church is waning, and there is growing chaos in the political field and growing control in the corporate field. So I would have to say the Illuminati seem to be ahead at this point.
They've always fought against science, and even though it's 400, 500 years late, they finally just got around to absolving Galileo of claiming that the sun was the center of the universe.
They would still kill Galileo today or chain him up. They would still burn Giordano Bruno at the stake as they did if they could get away with it. They just know they can't get away with it. They have to do this by other means. That is the hope. That is the plan. That is the strategy, to support situations in which chaos will reign.
Does the Illuminati still wield power in secret societies? Are they still fighting for a new world order?
This is a war that's been going on for a long time for control of the planet. How do you fight such a war?
And in the end, who will win?
To explore further and questioning things, and it was in an age of science was burgeoning and kind of busting out, literally almost, out of the confines of the Catholic Church. And so you had all these people like Galileo, and up into the 18th and 19th century, when exploration and this need for finding out things, how things worked in nature or in the universe, they just really had that need to find that out.
I think in earlier centuries the church probably was anti-science because they feared a conflict between their dogma and scientific knowledge.
Did Dan Brown have it right? Could the Illuminati still exist? Could they be trying to destroy world governments? In his investigation, Simon Cox believes the beginning of that answer lies in the very title of Dan Brown's book. A title that may lead us directly to the Illuminati.
The book Angels and Demons, I think, is titled so because what you have here in Dan Brown's estimation, I think, is the idea of the study of light and dark. And so you have this study in dualism. On the one side, we're not sure who the angels are. We're not sure whether the angels is the church or science, because this is a book about church versus science. On the other side, you have the demons. Are the demons science? Is it the church? We're unsure about this. And I think that that's the reasoning behind the title. I think it's quite a clever title to use.
Angels and Demons is a great title. It does sum up very well the duality of the book and the theme of angels that runs through it in the Bernini statues that form the clues that run throughout the book.
In Angels and Demons, the Illuminati gather in secret meeting places throughout ancient Rome. Each location anchors a surreptitious trail that Dan Brown calls the Path of Illumination. And each location is filled with Bernini's masterpieces, which allegedly hold clues to this subversive path, including his most famous work, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Her hand allegedly points towards this path of illumination. Surprisingly, it forms a nearly perfect cross within the city of Rome.
I think the path of illumination that Dan Brown highlights in his book is a real, it's something that has been used throughout history, although maybe not.
It is one of the most mysterious places on earth. An entire sovereign nation surrounded by a single city. The Vatican. For centuries, it has influenced world events, perhaps more than any other country on earth. How could the world's smallest country wield such power? Secrets. The secrets it holds behind these very walls.
It's a secret place for many reasons, and one is that it gets up to things it doesn't want people to know about.
This is the setting for Dan Brown's best-selling book, Angels and Demons. But are dark forces trying to destroy the church, as Dan Brown suggests?
I think secret societies evolved at that time and came about through a reaction to the ominous presence of the Catholic Church.
Could an ancient cult rise again to infiltrate Vatican security and assassinate a pope?
Popes have undoubtedly been murdered.
Could this same secret society be planning to take over world governments?
The agenda of all secret societies is to rule the masses so that the masses become slaves, fodder, malleable, useful, eliminatable laboratory animals.
And does this, the dollar bill, hold the secret to a new world order?
We have New World Order right here on our dollar bills, and yet most people are unaware of this.
One person is on a mission to uncover the answers to these very questions and more that are raised in Dan Brown's frightening book. Simon Cox, along with other noted experts, are about to tell us what's fact, what's fiction, and what has yet to be revealed. Rome, once the ruler of the Western world, Today, this nation city is both the cultural nerve center of Italy and the setting of Dan Brown's best-selling novel, Angels and Demons.
Rome is an amazing place, a city that is like none other than I've ever seen. It's a kind of revelation in the sense that at every turn there's something new. It's like a palimpsest, which is a manuscript in which something's been written, but it's been written over a pre-existing text that's been erased, which itself was written over a previous text that's been erased, so that it's layer upon layer, and it's that layering that is the city of Rome, endless and deep. When you turn a corner, there's a modern building sitting on a Roman building, sitting on something earlier still, and at every corner, at every turn is a new discovery.
But it's not only ancient buildings which lay hidden beneath Rome's streets. In the city where Caesar was murdered, where Constantine helped engineer the emerging religion of Christianity, a new and sinister society reportedly existed. The Illuminati, the Illuminated. Dan Brown's Angels and Demons raises vital questions. Do they still exist? And if they do, who are they?
The central theme within Angels and Demons is this idea of a secret society called the Illuminati. Did they really exist? If so, what period of history? Are they still around? These are questions that are really thrown at us from the book, and Dan Brown tries to answer them by saying, yes, they're a real secret society, they still exist today, they still exert influence and pressure, just as they did through history.
Historian Simon Cox has made a career of studying the past. Now he's making a career investigating the theories behind Dan Brown's mysteries. In his newest book, Illuminating Angels and Demons, Cox finds himself on the trail of the Illuminati, much like Dan Brown's hero, and for good reason.
It's a book that deals with secret societies, with Christianity and its interaction through the ages with us as people, as man, and the idea that there may actually be some other hidden thread of knowledge, of illumination that runs through that.
In the novel, a secret society known as the Illuminati sets out to destroy the Vatican and alter the course of world events. For writer and conspiracy theorist Jim Marrs, the threat is real.
The final goal of the Illuminati is world domination. They go into great detail as to how they're going to accomplish this. They want to educate the young and convert them to their way of thinking. They want to destroy faith and confidence not only in the political systems but in religion.
Fact is slightly different really to the fiction that Dan Brown has brought forward in Angels and Demons, in so much as the Illuminati, through my research I found, did exist as a real society. In fact, there were several different versions of the Illuminati. You have Illuminati springing up in southern France, in Spain.
A look through history books shows that over the centuries, several groups have taken on this name. In Spain, they were persecuted, burned at the stake by the Catholic Church during the famous Inquisitions. But the mystery doesn't stop there.
They're disparate groups, they're not groups that are linked, and the word Illuminati, or illuminated ones, or ones who see the light, is actually, when you think about it, would be a pretty normal name for various groups who want to be enlightened. And so I think that as a coherent body of people, a coherent secret society that has lasted throughout history, stretching all the way back to Egyptian times and through to the modern era, I think it's a non-starter. I don't think you have evidence for that. However, we certainly have evidence that a group called the Illuminati, who may well have existed through to modern times, certainly started in the 1770s in Bavaria.
The Illuminati was a secret society supposedly formed in the spring of 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, who had been trained by the Jesuits.
Devin Jackson is an investigative journalist for some of the most important publications of today. He believes the name Weishaupt is no accident. Jackson suggests that the name was fictitious, part of a secret code used throughout Europe that was the beginning of a fight by elite members of science against church-sponsored governments. Even more, Jackson believes the Illuminati may have started long before Adam Weishaupt took on the name. The question raised, however, is why would such a battle even exist?
The Illuminati came into existence around the time of Galileo because of having this need to...
In the context that Brown is actually bringing it forward within Angels and Demons, the idea behind neophytes, behind initiates actually walking a path, metaphorical or real, is something that we do find symbolically throughout history.
This alleged path starts at Rome's most famous landmark, the Vatican, a site visited by up to 30 million tourists a year. The path then crosses Tiber River to the east, anchored at Santa Maria della Vittoria. To the north, the cross begins at Santa Maria del Popolo and ends to the south at Piazza Navona. Why a cross for a group allegedly fighting the Church? Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett, co-authors of the Templar Revelation, have researched its mysterious origins.
Every religious, spiritual, esoteric discipline will talk about a metaphorical path of illumination.
Whether this exists in the sense of the Illuminati, a group somewhere, have their own views on this, and you have to be initiated into it and do certain things, perhaps horrible, to receive illumination, is open to question.
The Illuminati's scientific beginnings, their rituals, and quest for power are closely tied to the Vatican's own shrouded history. But hidden deep within the Vatican are secret documents which reportedly could be used to destroy the Church. Has the Illuminati infiltrated the Vatican? Have they found the hidden documents? And what will happen if they, or another secret society, finds them?
The Roman Church obviously is among the richest, most powerful institutions on the earth and has been for many centuries. And that's simply because if you go back to the time of the Middle Ages, the Church commanded everything.
For over 1,000 years, the Vatican influenced world events while wielding vast control